Good morning, Lakeview. Good morning. Good morning. We're going to be continuing our study of the book of Genesis. We are at the halfway point now. So just 6 more weeks after this, and we'll be off to study another book. It is this commitment to faithfulness that we must bring to our lives as readers if we would govern our reading by the law of love. A. Jacobs from Theology of Reading. I think that's a good principle, again, to go through as we study the Bible. So, again, we're going through Genesis. This is week 7. We're going to be talking about the binding of Isaac. Here is my bibliography. Wow, I can read this on that screen back there. They replaced the projector, and I can actually read my notes up on the screen. So if you need my slides or want to know my bibliography, just talk to me or talk to Ray. I'm sorry for blanking on your name, Ray, but yeah, talk to him and he can get it to you. So anyways, here's our objectives for this week. It's to understand how the Bible used repetition to reinforce a point, understand how God cares for the outcast, and understand how faith is not just belief, but belief with action. So let us begin with a prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for this time to study your word and to let it dwell in our hearts, Lord, and let the lessons from the patriarchs resonate in our lives as we learn the good things they do and the bad things, Lord. And just let us take these truths out into the world, Lord, in your name. Amen. All right, so Abraham sells Sarah again. Abraham heads to Gerar, which is in sort of southern Canaan, where he claims that Sarah is his sister again. Sarah goes along with it. Perhaps she's prepared to sacrifice her sexual integrity to protect her husband. Or does Abraham know that God will intervene because of their covenant? I mean, he did it once already. There's a verse about don't test the Lord. Maybe that's what Abraham might be doing. So anyways, King Abimelech takes Sarah into his harem. Then God tells Abimelech, I cannot say this name, Abimelech in a dream that he is a dead man for taking a married woman. Abimelech pleads his innocence because Abraham lied. God knows this and kept Abimelech from sleeping with her. He's ordered to return Sarah to her husband and to have Abraham pray for him since Abraham is a prophet. Abimelech does in the morning and is very angry at Abraham for putting him in this situation, which I think rightly so. Abraham does claim she's a half-sister, but they have different mothers. But is this another lie from Abraham, or is this the truth? This is the only time it's mentioned. We are never given any genealogy about Sarah, other than she seems to be from Ur. So Abimelech gives Abraham sheep and oxen, male and female servants, and 1,000 pieces of silver. Abraham prays for Abimelech, and God heals all the women of Abimelech's household because he had closed their wombs. Then there's a treaty then we see this treaty here, this treaty between Abram and Beersheba. We get it twice in Isaac and Gerar, and Jacob and Laban. So they kind of match these early second millennium treaties we find in archives, places like Mari and Tel Leon. So that's just another indication that this is definitely rooted in the early second millennium. And it would be very hard for someone in the post-exilic time or even the First Temple period to really get these sort of details right, because they would have different treaty structures. So why is the same story in here again? Yeah, so Miss Jackie says if God is saying something more than once, and the story is 3 times actually in Genesis, because we're going to see it with Isaac and Rebekah as well, that he is reinforcing a point here, that there is something significant that God is doing here. And I'm sorry, I didn't quite get your comment. We remember things through repetition. That's another thing, because you've got to remember that the vast majority of the audience that was going to hear Genesis, they were literate. They're not going to read it. They're going to hear it told and read to them. And so you're going to see these sort of patterns repeating themselves all over Scripture. Scripture is very much built on types that repeat themselves over and over again to reinforce theological points. Yes. So I think probably the biggest lesson is to show that using a woman as a pawn is maybe not a good idea, because this is what Abraham is doing here. It was very much a custom of the time to trade women between harems to build alliances. And although she seems to be complicit in it, I doubt she has much real agency in this matter. All right, so there is the Philistine problem here. So there's another anachronism we see in Genesis is Philistines being used in Genesis 21:32, verse 24, Genesis 26, of Abimelech of Gerar. Because the Philistines are one of 5 tribes of the sea people who settled along the Mediterranean coast. This did not happen until like 1180 BC or so during the reign of Ramses III. So this phrase, in the land of Philistines, that we see in verse 32 and 34, appears to be a later scribal note to inform readers where this is located. A way to think about this is to say that the Dutch founded New York City. Well, actually, they founded New Amsterdam, which was renamed New York, but we still would refer to it as New York, because that's just what people know. It's just a shorthand. So why does it say Abimelech is being a Philistine king when he's not even at Gath or Gaza or one of the Pentapolis cities that they settled, but this place called Gerar, which is nearby, but it's not the heart of Philistine territory? It's possible Abimelech, and especially his retainer Philcol, were Caphatorians or Carathites, which are an Aegean Greek island people who settled in Canaan in this time, and in later generations, Philistine became a blanket term for Aegean people living in Canaan. So that might be explained why we have this. Especially Philcol's name, there seems to be a name we find on like Crete that is very similar to it at this time. Okay. The Lord came to Sarah, just as he said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah conceived and gave birth to a son for Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had predicted. Abraham named his son, who was born to him, Isaac, the very one whom Sarah bore for him. On the 8th day, after his son Isaac had been born, Abraham circumcised him, just as God commanded. Now, I do want to point out something. There's actually no mention of sex here, right? It's almost as if Sarah has a miraculous conception, right? Although the son is definitely Abraham's. The text is, doesn't say Abraham knew his wife and she conceived. The text is being very clear here that God is responsible for this conception. And this is a type that we're going to see later on with Mary, right? So in a way, Sarah is a precursor to Mary, just as Eve is a precursor to Mary. So Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Now Sarah had said, God has caused me to laugh, and all who hear about it will laugh with me. She's happy here, right? Last time she laughed in incredulity, but now she's laughing for joy because she is, 90, 91 here, and she has finally had a son. She also said, who would have told Abraham that Sarah would nurse sons? This is the first time a woman is mentioned nursing in the Bible, by the way. Yet I have given birth to a son in my husband's old age. So can you just feel the joy that she has here in the text, right? But now there's the wrench in the socket because we have Hagar, right? So Abraham throws a feast when Isaac is weaned. 2nd Maccabees says it's custom to wean a child at 3 years. The feast is probably thrown because of the high infancy mortality rate of the time. Your child made it to 3, made it to eating solid foods is a celebration, right? Because so many infants in this time don't make it that far. During the feast, Sarah noticed Ishmael, although he's never called by name in this section, laughing at her son and gets angry, right? Given Isaac's name is associated with laughter, it's almost as Ishmael's trying to take Isaac's place by being the one laughing. Sarah demands Abraham to banish Ishmael and that woman. Abraham does not want to do that because Ishmael is still his son. Plus, Mesopotamian laws that speak on the situation. So while the wife's son gets the inheritance, the man still has to care for the concubine's son, even if they're older. So he still has to be responsible for Ishmael according to the custom of the time, even though the inheritance will go to Isaac. There's no dispute of that at all in the customs of this time. God tells Abraham not to worry about Hagar and Ishmael and to listen to his wife. God will make a nation out of Ishmael as he previously promised to Hagar. Abraham trusts God, so the next morning he gives his concubine and son bread and water and sends her away. This is a euphemism for divorce. And they head out to the wilderness of Beersheba. So Hagar and her son run out of water. Dehydrated, her son, who is about 11 or 12 at this time, is too weak. She leaves him beneath a bush, unable to watch him die. She cries. These are the first tears shed in the Bible. Sarah laughed for Isaac, but Hagar weeps for her son. God hears Ishmael crying out and sends an angel to minister to them. The promise that Ishmael will become a great nation is reiterated to Hagar, and she's shown where water is found. El Roi, this is the name Hagar is given God, has seen their suffering and has listened to Ishmael. Again, Ishmael means God has listened, right? So they live in the wilderness of Paran, where Ishmael becomes good with a bow. Hagar finds him an Egyptian wife. Not surprising, Hagar is Egyptian. El Roi means God who sees, or God who has seen. So yeah, that's the name Hagar gave him in the last episode we have with Hagar. So here's just a comparison of how Hagar's story kind of repeats itself, but with the little differences. Sarah's infertile, Sarah's fertile. Sarah's response is to sleep with Hagar, and just on and on. These are sort of the way that Genesis reiterates itself. Okay. And then we have the treaty with Abimelech. So we've been dealing with Abimelech in the previous part, then it's interrupted by the birth of Isaac. Now we're back to dealing with the treaty with Abimelech, right? So Abraham has to, okay, this is really bad grammar here. So Abraham discovers there's a problem with a well that's been taken from him by Abimelech. I think I got their names mixed up in this section. So Phicol, the commander of Abimelech's army, asks Abraham, a righteous man, to not deal falsely with him. Abraham swears not to. It seems Abraham's force is large enough to worry Phicol and his king Abimelech. So Abraham is prospered enough that the local king is worried about this nomad out on the edge of his territory. So Abraham's not happy that his well got taken, right? So he goes to Abimelech to complain. Abimelech didn't order the well seizure. He seems to be unaware that this happened. The two men come to a covenant about the well, Abraham paying sheep and oxen. Then Abraham sets apart 7 ewes and gives them to Abimelech as a witness to their covenant. So Abraham calls this well Beersheba. He plants a tamarisk tree and called on the everlasting God there. And Abraham settles there for a while, having secured a treaty with a local power and a water source for his flock. Beersheba is a bit of a pun in Hebrew, since Seba means 7 and Saba means swear. So it means both the 7 wells and the oath well at the same time. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He called out to Abraham. "Here I am," he answered. And that's a very common way when God calls for you, say, "Here I am." We see this all over the Bible. God said, "Please take your son, your unique son whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah. Offer him as a burnt offering there on one of the mountains that I will point out to you." So we don't really know how long this has been, but Isaac is certainly old enough to carry firewood, so he's not a small child. In fact, the word that's used from Na'ar is used with Shechem and Dinah in that situation later on. It's also used for the 2 servants that are going with them that we see. They're both get the same word. And also the fighters that Abraham recruited back in Genesis 14 also are called Na'ar. So it seems to be more young man. So it's really hard to say exactly how old Isaac is, but old enough that he's not just a little child naively going along with his father, I think. And I think that's something to keep in mind as we read this story. So Abraham got up early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his male servants with him, along with his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering and set out to go to the place which God had spoken to him. On the 3rd day, he looked ahead and saw the place from a distance. Now, from Beersheba, it's more than a 3-day walk to Jerusalem where they're going. But again, he's just seeing it from this point. So that lines up with sort of the distance he needs to travel. Then Abraham ordered his 2 servants, "Both of you are to stay here with the donkey. Now as for the youth and me, we'll go up there, we'll worship, and we'll return to you." And Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac. Abraham carried the fire and the knife, and so the 2 of them went on together. If you're wondering how they carried the fire, it's probably in a horn from an oxen. This is a very common way to carry fire with nomads. You put a coal from the previous night's fire, you put tinder in there, and you can keep that coal alive through the course of the day and then use it to start your next fire once you get to where you're going, so you don't have to spend the effort of using like a fire bow or friction methods, because that's very arduous and not always reliable, even for someone who knows what they're doing. Isaac addressed his father, Abraham, "My father." "I'm here, my son." Just lost my microphone. Abraham replied, Isaac asked, "The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God will provide himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." The 2 of them went on together and came to the place about which God had spoken. So Isaac's asking questions here, but he trusts his father. He has faith in his father and in their God. So it's not just Abraham's faith on display here. We also see Isaac's faith. And as you see, it gets worse. I mean, Abraham built an altar there, arranged the wood, tied up his son, Isaac, and placed him on the altar on top of the wood. Abraham is an old man. Isaac, maybe a teenager. If Isaac wanted to, he could certainly resist, but he doesn't. He allows himself to be tied up and placed on the altar. Then he, Abraham, stretched out his hand and grabbed the knife to slaughter his son. Just then, an angel of the Lord called out from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he answered. "Don't lay your hand on the youth," he said. "Don't do anything to him, because I've just demonstrated that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only unique one, from me." Notice we have twice unique one. I'm pretty sure the Septuagint has a very similar word to monogenes here. Dan is nodding his head yes. So we're having a typology of Christ. It's on the Temple Mount. It's where in the area of Jerusalem. This is very much a foreshadowing of what we're going to see on the crucifixion. Then Abraham looked up and behind him to see a ram caught by its horns in the thicket. So Abraham went over, grabbed the ram, and offered it as a burnt offering in place of his son. So it's an adult male. He said it would be a lamb, but it's an adult male that he actually finds. Another interesting parallel there. Abraham named the place, "The Lord will provide," as it is told to this day, "On the Lord's mountain he will provide." The angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, "I have taken an oath to myself." And notice it's from heaven. The angel of the Lord is speaking from heaven. That's another very interesting thing we see here. And said, "I have taken an oath to swear by myself, declares the Lord." Now the Lord speaking. This is no longer the angel of the Lord. It's the angel of the Lord speaking. Now it's the Lord speaking as if, the angel of the Lord is the Lord. "That since you have carried this out and have not withheld your only unique son." And also notice, this is the first time God actually swears an oath. He makes covenants, but he never makes an oath until this moment. "I will certainly bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in heaven and as the sands on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the gates of their enemies. Furthermore, through your descendants, all the nations of the earth will be blessed because you have obeyed my command." So notice this possession of the gate of the enemies. This is what Rebekah's family is later going to bless her with when she goes off to marry Isaac, for her sons to do this very thing, that the gates of their enemies will not prevail against them. "Furthermore, through your descendants, all the nations of the earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed my command." After this, Abraham returned to his servant and set out together for Beersheba, where Abraham settled.
That's interesting there in verse 18. The translation that you're copying from, the word descendants, is that plural there?
It's plural in this translation.
It's interesting because I think Paul's in Galatians where he talks about in the prophecy the seed, and he specifically says in Galatians that it's singular, your seed. So it just is interesting how that...
It is singular elsewhere, but it's also through the Jewish preserving their faith for so long that it's able to propagate. So with their descendants, the earth is blessed. I think if you look into like sciences and history and economic developments, that there's quite a lot of Jewish people that are involved in our society and stuff, and they still, I would still say, to an extent, are still blessing the nations with their presence. Yeah. Yes, Brent.
Here in this text, both times it is singular in Hebrew.
It is singular in the Hebrew. Interesting.
Singular in Hebrew, not plural.
Interesting. Well, did I copy it wrong?
The NIV says offspring, which kind of is a general for multiple.
Interesting. Is it the same with the descendants that will take the enemy's gate, Brent? In verse 17? Interesting. Well, I think descendant, that makes sense too. That would be a reference to Jesus. So.
And it corresponds with Strong's Hebrew number 2233. With noun, common, singular, construct.
Okay. Yeah, I'm looking at my interlinear in the ESV, and it's definitely singular. Yeah. Okay. Sadly, usually ISV is very good at giving translation notes for why they do things, and there is not one for why they use descendants there.
I think it's kind of like that version. It's more of a interpretation rather than a translation.
Yeah, the ISV is sometimes a word for word, and sometimes it's more a thought for thought, I've noticed. All right, are we going to work? Can you advance the slide, Ray? My clicking thingy isn't working. All right, so did Abraham believe he would truly have to sacrifice his son? Kathy thinks yes, he really thought he had to. Yeah, Dan?
The author of Hebrews in the New Testament conveys that Abraham believed God could raise him from the dead. So, according to Artemis, yeah.
Yeah, so who said that? I'm sorry, I was distracted for a moment.
The author of Hebrews,
Oh, the author of Hebrews says that, yeah. That's what the rabbis teach too, that Abraham thought that Isaac would be killed, but then God would just resurrect him. Because God promised that Isaac was the seed, and so therefore Isaac had to survive this encounter somehow. Yeah. Yes, Don.
I think it's an incredible testament to the faith of Abraham that in spite of the fact that it taken him all these years to get a son of his own with his wife, now God tells him to sacrifice his son. And I think it's very difficult for us to comprehend that. And at the same time, it showed his faith, his belief. And that belief is carried on throughout the New Testament in discussions about the faith of Abraham. And God credits him as righteousness. It's that trusting in God. It's like, I don't know exactly how this is going to happen, but God said, take my only son and offer it as a sacrifice. So yes, I firmly believe that Abraham believed he would have to offer his son as a sacrifice.
Yeah, so Don was talking about that shows the depth of Abraham's faith, which is later in the New Testament said that righteousness was credited to him for his faith. And this is the climax of Abraham's story right here, right? Yes, Nathan.
And I think potentially it was his obligation to show more faith.
Yeah, so Nathan's comment that Abraham's faith had lacked before, he was told to settle in Canaan, and then when there was the first problem, he ran to Egypt, and then he and Hagar, or Sarah, tried to get a son their way instead of God's way, showing another sign of lack of faith. But now here he is at the end of his journey, the end of his life. They're seeing everything that he's done, and he chooses faith, yes.
It's important that we not see the marriage of Abraham and Hagar as jumping the gun or trying to do things their way. This was the law. Their country's law required Sarah to get a second wife for her husband. She was expected to do that when she'd been sterile for 3 or 4 years. She's 70 years old before she gives in to the law of the land. She's not jumping the gun. She's delaying obeying the law. This is an act that was really, finally they gave in. And that's what created a situation where it would be a real miracle for what God was going to do later with Ishmael.
Yeah, so I do understand that with the Sarah and Hagar thing, it was a legal thing for them to do, that Sarah had every right to do that. I don't think she had to do it. She had the right to exercise that option to do it, because Abraham does have an heir. His name is Eliezer of Damascus. He's probably the servant that gets sent after Rebekah that we see later on. So that's another option that they had at the time, was to just have an heir that they adopt. But
My understanding of the law of Hammurabi is that it was not an option. She had a requirement to do that.
okay.
Sarah had to get somebody. She chose her maiden.
I haven't seen that reference, but if you say it's in the law, Dan. But either way, we're seeing Abraham's faith journey, and this is its culmination. Any other comments?
In a similar sense, we all are to sacrifice. God gives us everything. He gives us our family, our possessions, and in the same way, similar way, we're not sacrificing our firstborn like he was asked to do, but we are asked to sacrifice whatever we got to serve God.
Yeah, so we are, God, Jesus does tell us to pick up our crosses and to follow him. And in fact, Isaac carries his own, wood to burn him on the altar, which would be the equivalent of his cross. Yeah. Yes, Don.
I thought I heard that the law that Sarah provides a wife for her husband. I don't see that in Scripture.
We see this in extra biblical ancient Near East material, like the Code of Hammurabi and texts we find in in Mari, which is up near Damascus. So we just see that this is the custom that of the land Abraham came out of. And so while the Bible doesn't explain this, when we look at other material, it enhances our understanding of what's going on there, and why it's why Rebekah has a nurse sent with her. That's actually the backup concubine. Just like the 2 nurses for Rachel and Leah are used as the backup concubines. Rebekah's nurse isn't, but that is why she's sent with the nurse. Any other comments? All right. So we're given Rebekah's genealogy real quick. So Genesis is preparing us for the next part of the story. So Abraham learns about his brother Nahor and his wife Milcah have had 3 sons. Again, 3 sons. We keep having 3 sons being born in Genesis. Uz, Buz, and Kemuel. And his secondary wife Remuah has had other sons. Kemuel had many sons, including Aram, whose descendants would be the Arameans in Syria, whose language Aramaic would go on to dominate Assyrian Babylon. And Bethuel was the father of Rebekah and Laban, though he's not actually mentioned yet. So, at 127, Sarah dies at Kirith Arbor, which is in Hebron. Abraham went to mourn for Sarah, implying he was not with her when she died, since he's last mentioned living in Beersheba by that well and not in Hebron. Perhaps she was just tired of following the herds and wanted to live in a more permanent camp. Abraham has settled there in the past. He does have good relations with the people in Hebron. They're the ones who went and helped him get Lot back, so they have a really good relationship there. So anyways, Abraham goes there and he asks the Hittites for a cave to bury his wife. Respecting Abraham, as I said, these are the men that went to fight for him. They claim he can pick his choice of burial caves, and none will deny him. He wants to buy the cave at Machpelah from Ephron, son of Zohar. Abraham wants the cave only, but Ephron wants to sell him the field too, the entire parcel of land instead of just a piece of it. This is for tax purposes. Ephron doesn't want to pay taxes on a land that he doesn't fully own. Abraham doesn't want to be burdened with paying taxes on the land he might not see for a while. Anyways, Ephron also seems to quote an outrageous price of 400 shekels of silver. It's almost as if no one in Hebron really wants to sell a burial cave, and he just sends out a price so outrageous that it'll be refused. But Abraham actually doesn't haggle, he just pays it. Thus he secures the burial site for the patriarchs and matriarchs save for Rachel. Oh, we are done already. Do we have any other comments about Abraham?
I heard a minister say once that the reason why there seems to be a separation between Sarah and Abraham is that Sarah was not thrilled with what happened on the mountain.
That's very true. It's some take it that Sarah even is what killed her, was learning that he was taking their son up to sacrifice him on the mountain. Because that's the next time we're mentioned. We don't really know how much time there is. We know there's there's like almost 30 years separating his birth and her death. Or I think it's like 26 years, if I'm doing my math correctly. So we don't know exactly when it happened, but yeah, there is that thought out there that Sarah was not happy with this, and that is why they are living separately. Yes?
Just a comment to the law of Haramadi, and looking here on the great cultures, the translation that they have for Law 145, it says, if a man takes a wife and she does not present him with children, and he sets his face to take a concubine, that man may take a concubine and bring her into his house. That concubine shall not take precedent over his wife. So it says if, and if he says it. In the text, the biblical text, it says that Sarah was the one that approached Abraham. In 146, it says, if a man takes a wife and she gives a maidservant to her husband, and she bears children, and afterwards that maidservant will take precedent over her mistress because she has borne children. Her mistress may not sell her for money, but she may reduce her to bondage and count her among the maidservants. So those are two of the laws that would, I think, speak to that, but it doesn't seem like it has to happen, but it could happen. The law made an opportunity for the husband to take a concubine, but it's not like they had to according to this translation from the great cultures.
Yeah, so Brent was just quoting the law code of Hammurabi about the situation, and it does say if the wife is barren, that the man may take a concubine, not that he must take a concubine. And then there's other stuff about how the wife can't sell the concubine if she produces an heir, but she can basically liberate her from her bondage and make her a maidservant. But she doesn't have to do that, so she could still keep her as a slave, which it seems Sarah did. Yeah. Yes, Dan?
This understanding this dynamic between these people is helpful as we interact with the Muslim community of our time. They identify very strongly with Ishmael and, of course, with Hagar.
Yeah.
So understanding the way that God interacts with Hagar and Ishmael is helpful for us with people of our time. God speaks to Hagar. God doesn't ignore her. We don't see God speaking to just everybody back in the ancient times. He speaks to Hagar, and he gives her hope. He gives her a phrase could also be used that God's purpose for Ishmael was to be the person that called for accountability, the cop, if you will, the person that would be protecting and also causing obedience among those who were not wanting to be obedient. You could see Ishmael as having a positive future as the disciplinarian, the soldier at arms for the community. That would be encouraging to his heart. That's the context in which God is speaking to him. He's trying to encourage her. He's not telling her that her son's going to be a criminal. That would not be encouraging. So Ishmael can be seen as having his first calling to be the police person of that community. He would be protecting Isaac, and he would also be disciplining Isaac or his heirs when they got aside from God. Because God is the one that is establishing this future for Ishmael. I think that's a very valuable way for us to describe this family to our Muslim community, because they think we hate it. This would be a way to show the good side of Ishmael and Hagar.
Okay, so Darren's point is that there's a view that when it says Ishmael is going to be opposing them, that it's more like he's going to be a disciplinarian on the descendants of Isaac to make sure that they're being faithful. That's his role in the matter. And that this is a tension with the Muslims because they believe that Muhammad is an Ishmaelite, that the original followers of Muhammad were all Ishmaelites, and that they take a great deal of pride about that. It's very central in their mythology, Hagar and Ishmael. The whole events we've seen with, where we just read today, where Hagar and Ishmael are in the desert looking for water. They think that took place down in Mecca. That's what the Hajj is all about, is about this event right here, where Hagar gets visited by God and is shown the well. They think it's called the Zamzam well in Mecca. They have two mounds of rock where they say she was running back and forth between these two mountains. So yeah, that's very central to their religion, the story of Hagar and Ishmael.
Also, according to them, it was Ishmael who was sacrificed.
Yeah, they do replace. I do believe that's correct. They replaced Ishmael with Isaac in the binding story, but that's not uncommon. Muhammad would take very common Christian and Jewish stories, and even secular stories like about Alexander the Great, and just sort of repurpose them for Islam. We know his sources. We know like what the stories were around in the 7th century, and we can see where he got most of his material from. But yeah.
I appreciate Brother Camp's comment that we today are supposed to realize that our children aren't ours. I struggle with this story. I don't know that I would have the faith of Abraham, and I struggle with the fact that there are so many non-believers that see the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament as being different. And that the idea that God would ask Abraham to sacrifice his son, even though culturally children being sacrificed to gods, we see that in other places in the Bible. I don't know how to help a non-believer see that this is just a story about showing that you have faith.
Yeah, it's a very troubling thing. Soren Kierkegaard wrote an entire book as he's trying to reason through this, because this story is so different from heroic stories of other cultures, because Abraham doesn't give us his thoughts. We don't know what he was thinking in this moment. We don't know if he thought this was a good thing, a bad thing, if he was reluctant. We don't see any repercussions for him, you know. So this isn't like a Greek tale of tragedy. Nor is this like a heroic thing. It's presented in a very weird way, and he had to come up with a whole new philosophical system to account for this, which he calls faith. And because yeah, he really did wrestle with it. Yeah, he just calls it this new, because this. So I'm just going off of the paragraph I read about the plot description. I haven't read this book, but apparently he was trying to wrestle between two different philosophical ways of looking at it and realizes neither one of them work, and he had to create a third philosophical one that he dubbed faith. Yeah. But I only discovered this book about a week ago, and I didn't have a chance to read it before this week. So, any other comments? We have a couple minutes left. Yes, Miss Jackie?
I'm not sure I know how to express this.
Okay.
I think one of the reasons that Jesus commended the innocence of children, and by doing so, I think wanted us to be more like that, is that we be able to simply accept some of these things without going into all the suppositions and historical references and so forth. All of those are interesting, but I don't think that they are necessary to our faith.
True. So Miss Jackie's point is that why Jesus wanted us to have the faith of children is because they're very accepting of things. They don't, we think about these things now that we're adults. We have all this knowledge, right? We're burdened with it sometimes, and it makes us question things. We look at this story and go, how could God ask Abraham to do this, right? How does that square up with other passages about him? And it's something we all have to wrestle with, and having the faith of a child would make that soul searching a lot easier, and it's something we should strive for. But I think wrestling with these answers are useful, especially for people that have their doubts, for people who look at this and they find it abhorrent that we have answers for them. Yes, Brent.
The story of the sacrifices of Abraham and Isaac. One, Abraham was as good as dead. Abraham was an old man. His wife was old. He did not have children, and he was not going to have any children with Sarah. And so Isaac, in and of himself, was already something that was far beyond anything that Abraham could have done for himself. Right? It was a gift. And then the question about him offering up his son goes back to God himself, because God is building a narrative for the familial community, right? The family community, and that this is his son. But not only that this is Abraham's son, right? But that God was willing to give up his son, right? And to give a gift that you can't earn, to give a gift that you can't buy, to give a gift that you don't deserve. And all of those things were given to Abraham, which is a type for what God himself is doing, not just with Abraham, but what God is doing with the whole of humanity. And it comes down to, do we see that everything really is a gift from God? And if it is, are we willing to surrender everything to the will of God? Because if we're willing to surrender everything to the will of God, then we know that God, whatever God has given us and whatever God is going to do with us, is going to be okay. Because he didn't have to make us in the first place. He didn't have to give us anything in the first place. He didn't have to give us life, but he did. We're here. And so I think all those things together, build a narrative, if you will, a philosophy of faith that is unlike the world. Very different from the world.
Yeah, so Brent was saying that Isaac was given to Abraham a miraculous gift that he couldn't get on his own. That's why God waited until Sarah's past menopause, just to drive home that fact. Just as we're given the gift of our existence, right? That's a gift from God. Everything we have is a gift from God, and we should be willing to sacrifice what God has given us for his glory, is, I think, what Brent was trying to say. Did I summarize that correctly, Brent?
Yeah, pretty close.
Okay. And with that, let's just end with a prayer. Heavenly Father, I just want to thank you for the life I have and the life of everyone here in my Lakeview family, Lord, and I'm just so grateful to have them in my life, that you have given me this gift, Lord, and I'm just so glad that I can study the Word with them, Lord, and that we can dive deeper into understanding your love in all its facets, Lord. And just thank you so much for all that you do for us, Lord, and be with us as we go out into the world. In your name, amen.